Tonight, three magical tales await. First, Rapunzel stands at her high window, braiding her shimmering golden hair into a long, heavy rope that reaches the forest floor. She hears a sharp whistle from the brush and lowers the braid, slowly pulling a mysterious visitor upward into the cold stone room. Next, we travel to a silent castle where a princess sleeps on the velvet bed. Thick vines cover the ancient stone walls, and the clock finally strikes the end of 100-year silence. She opens her eyes as the soft dust settles on the floor, the spell finally broken. Finally, a brave princess stands in a snowy clearing, surrounded by 4 enchanted stags with silver antlers. When a dark shadow approaches, the stags lower their heads in unison, their glowing horns forming a brilliant barrier of light. The princess steps forward with her sword in hand, her eyes fierce, as the forest creatures bow to her command in the winter chill. The journey ends here, but the dreams are just beginning. Get comfortable now. Close your eyes and let the magic take hold of your heart. Sleep well, for the tales are safe with you.
Golden sun blazed. Markets thrived. Life hummed. Ink-black forest wall. Light absorbed. Within a cottage of weathered wood, the floorboards groaned under the weight of a man who could not find rest. He paced the length of the room, his boots clicking in a steady, frantic rhythm that measured his growing dread. He did not look outside. He kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. By the window, his wife remained motionless. She sat with her hands pressed against her swollen belly, her posture rigid. Her gaze was locked onto the towering stone barrier that separated their small garden from the forbidden domain of the sorceress. The husband stopped his pacing, his chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow bursts as he watched her stare into the dark, impenetrable tree line. She finally moved. Her hand rose, trembling, and pressed against the cold glass of the window. Beyond the barrier, the rampion leaves shimmered with a sickly, bioluminescent glow, casting long, pulsing shadows across her face. Her eyes widened, mirroring the garden's eerie glow. She whispered, her voice thin and brittle, that the scent of those leaves was the only thing that could steady her breath. She described the smell as sharp, metallic, and sweet, a fragrance that clawed at her senses until she could think of nothing else. Her fingers traced the outline of the stone wall through the glass, her nails clicking against the pane in a frantic, repetitive motion. The husband watched her, his own hands clenching into fists at his sides. He saw the way she leaned into the cold barrier. He turned toward the door, his jaw set, and reached for the latch. The door creaked open, and he stepped into the biting night air. The garden was silent, save for the distant, rhythmic rustle of leaves. He moved toward the stone barrier, his boots sinking into the damp earth of the flower bed. Up close, the wall loomed higher, a jagged mass of gray rock that seemed to absorb the moonlight. He gripped the first ledge, his palms scraping against the rough, uneven masonry. He pulled himself up, his muscles straining against the cold stone. Halfway to the top, a loose rock shifted under his left boot, sending a spray of grit tumbling into the darkness below. He froze, his fingers digging into a narrow crevice, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He held his breath, waiting for a sound from the other side, but the forest remained unnervingly still. He forced his weight upward, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He hauled his body over the final jagged edge and dropped silently onto the soft, mossy ground of the forbidden garden. The air here was different, thicker, smelling of damp earth and something metallic. He stood, his knees shaking, and looked toward the center of the clearing. There, pulsing with that same unnatural bioluminescent light, the rampion leaves swayed in the dark, waiting for his blade. He knelt in the dirt, the soil cool and damp beneath his palms. He pulled his knife from his belt, the steel catching the faint, pulsing glow of the leaves. He reached out, his fingers brushing the stems, and began to cut. The first leaf fell, then the second, each slice quiet and precise. He worked quickly, his eyes darting between the patch and the surrounding trees. He stuffed the greens into his sack, the fabric rustling loudly in the unnatural quiet. Then, The air changed. The warmth of the night vanished, replaced by a sudden biting frost that turned his breath into white plumes. He stopped, his hand hovering over a thick cluster of stalks. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate, a low hum resonating through his boots. He looked up, searching for a source, but the forest was a wall of black. Behind him, the stone wall shifted. It was not the wind. Night's shadow peeled, a jagged form, heart pounding. He faced the void, a shadow blocking his escape. Before he could take a step, a hand clamped onto his wrist. The grip was like iron, biting into his skin and forcing his arm to twist at an unnatural angle. He gasped, the knife slipping from his fingers to land silently in the moss. He tried to pull away, but the force was absolute, dragging him down until his knees struck the hard, uneven ground. He looked up, his chest heaving, his eyes wide as he searched for a way out. There was none. The figure loomed over him, her presence heavy and suffocating in the freezing air. She leaned in, her face inches from his, and he could feel the cold radiating from her skin. He stammered, his voice cracking as he pleaded for his wife, explaining the sickness, the need, the desperation that had driven him to the garden. She did not blink. She did not soften. Instead, she tightened her hold, the pressure sharp enough to make his vision blur. She spoke, her voice a low, jagged rasp that cut through the silence. She demanded the child as payment for his life and his trespass. The weight of the choice pressed down on him, heavier than the stone wall he had climbed. He gave a single, broken nod. He had traded his future for a moment of survival. Winter yielded to spring's hollow embrace. Milk and smoke filled the cottage. Moonless night, pale child, hearth-lit hair, golden sheen. Parents watched window. Shadowed cradle waits. Forest remembers. Candles flickered out as the door creaked open. Parents froze. A figure glided, silent rustle. Moonlit silhouette. Fingers cradle infant. Shadows swallowed him. Silence claimed the empty cradle. The tower was a cylinder of seamless stone, cold to the touch and devoid of corners. Berries dyed murals. Charcoal traced tales. She painted forests she had never walked, and skies she had only seen through the narrow slit of the window. When the sun reached its zenith, the routine began. A voice echoed from the base of the tower, sharp and demanding. Rapunzel moved to the window, her movements practiced and devoid of hesitation. She uncoiled her hair, a heavy, shimmering rope that cascaded down the exterior like a waterfall of gold. She braced her feet against the inner wall, her muscles tightening as she felt the weight of the climber pulling against her scalp. It was a rhythmic, agonizing strain that defined her existence. She watched the figure ascend, hand over hand, until the sorceress pulled herself over the ledge. There was no warmth in the exchange, only the delivery of supplies and the cold scrutiny of the woman who held the key. Once the ritual concluded, the hair was coiled back, the window was barred, and the silence returned. Rapunzel stood alone in the center of the room, her hands aching, staring at the stone walls that held her world in place. She picked up a piece of charcoal and began to paint again, filling the empty space with the only life she knew. Prince Stefan pushed his horse through the dense thicket, the branches clawing at his leather gear. The forest here was tangled, a web of thorns and ancient, gnarled roots that forced him to dismount. He moved on foot, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He was miles from the kingdom, deep in a territory the maps had long ago abandoned. Then, the wind shifted. A melody drifted through the canopy, clear and piercing, rising above the rustle of leaves like a bell tolling in the void. Stefan froze. He pressed his back against the rough bark of an oak tree, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. He crept forward, parting the heavy foliage with careful, measured movements. The sound grew stronger, vibrating in the air. He rounded a cluster of ferns and saw it a tower of seamless stone rising from the gloom. He stayed low, hidden in the shadows of the undergrowth, and watched. He watched as the golden braid cascaded down the stone, a shimmering rope of light that defied the darkness of the woods. The secret was laid bare. The forest fell silent as the sorceress retreated into the shadows. Stefan waited until the last rustle of leaves faded. He stepped into the clearing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked up at the window, took a breath, and mimicked the call. The sound was thin, but it carried. Above, the window creaked open. The golden braid tumbled down, uncoiling in the air like a living thing. Stefan grabbed the hair, his palms slick with sweat, and began the climb. He hauled himself over the ledge, his boots scraping the stone floor. He stood up, expecting the familiar face of the sorceress. Instead, he found himself staring into the eyes of a woman he had never seen. Rapunzel did not hesitate. She swung a heavy iron pan, the metal whistling through the air, and forced him to duck. She backed into the corner, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle. Stefan raised his hands, palms open, his expression one of surrender. She studied his face. The pan still held high, but the sharp edge of her fear began to soften into a flicker of intense, searching curiosity. The iron pan clattered to the floor, forgotten. Stefan knelt, pulling a bundle of fine, stolen silk from his satchel. Rapunzel reached out, her fingers tracing the smooth fabric, a stark contrast to the rough stone of her prison. They began to work. Day after day, they braided the silk into a cord, their hands moving in rhythm, fingers brushing against each other as they knotted the strands. The tower, once a place of solitude, became a workshop of quiet whispers and shared glances. Rapunzel learned the texture of the world beyond the window through his stories, while Stefan learned the language of her murals. One afternoon, the rhythm broke. A sharp snap of a twig echoed from the forest floor far below. They froze. Rapunzel lunged for the unfinished rope, shoving it deep under her mattress, while Stefan pressed his back against the wall, his breath held tight. They looked at each other, the danger only serving to pull them closer. The rope was growing longer, and with every knot, the walls felt less like a cage. The routine was absolute. Gothel arrived at the base of the tower, her voice cutting through the morning mist. Rapunzel uncoiled the golden braid, the weight of the sorceress pulling against her scalp as she hauled her upward. It was a familiar, grinding labor. As Gothel climbed over the ledge, her boots hitting the stone floor with a sharp click, Rapunzel wiped the sweat from her forehead. She stood up, her muscles aching from the strain. She looked at the sorceress, her mind still lingering on the secret work she had shared with Stefan. Without thinking, she let the words fall. "You are so much heavier than the prince," she remarked, a casual observation of the physical difference. The room went cold. Gothel froze mid-step. She did not turn around immediately, but the air in the tower thickened, turning stagnant and heavy. Gothel's shoulders shifted, her posture hardening into something predatory. She slowly turned her head, her eyes narrowing until they were nothing more than thin, dark slits. Gothel moved with a speed that defied her age. She lunged, her fingers digging into the golden mass of hair before Rapunzel could retreat. From the hidden folds of her sleeve, she produced a pair of iron shears. The blades caught a sliver of light, flashing like a predator's tooth. Rapunzel gasped, reaching out, but the metal snapped shut with a sickening, clean sound. The heavy braid fell, hitting the stone floor with a dull thud. Rapunzel scrambled backward, her hands flying to her head, feeling the jagged, uneven ends of her shorn scalp. The air in the tower turned frantic. Gothel did not hesitate. She grabbed Rapunzel by the shoulder, her grip bruising and absolute, and dragged her toward the window. Rapunzel clawed at the stone ledge, her nails scraping against the rock. But the sorceress was relentless. With a final, violent shove, Gothel pushed her out. Rapunzel tumbled through the empty air, the wind rushing past her ears, before she slammed into the hard, sun-scorched earth of the wasteland below. She lay there, gasping, the silence of the desert replacing the familiar echoes of the tower. Above her, the window was a dark, empty eye, and the golden rope was gone. Prince Stefan rode through the thicket as the sun began to dip, his pulse quickening with the promise of the climb. He reached the base of the tower and called out the familiar melody, his voice ringing against the stone. Golden rope uncoiled, light fading. He gripped braid and hauled himself upward with rhythmic, practiced strength. He reached the ledge, his breath hitching in his chest, ready to call her name. He vaulted over the sill, but the room was not empty. Gothel stood in the center, her fingers curled around the severed golden locks. The prince froze, his hands still gripping the window frame. Before he could retreat, she lunged. Her palms slammed into his chest with unnatural force. He lost his footing, his fingers slipping from the stone, and he tumbled backward into the void. He plummeted, the air whistling past his ears, until he struck the dense, tangled thicket below. The sharp, woody needles pierced his eyes with a sudden, searing agony. He hit the ground, the world dissolving into a jagged, black void of pain. Stefan pushed himself up from the thorns, his hands slick with blood. He reached out, fingers trembling, but found only empty air and the rough, unyielding bark of distant trees. The world had become a suffocating, featureless void. He took a tentative step, his boot catching on a hidden root, and he sprawled forward into the dirt. He did not cry out. He simply pressed his palms into the cold, dry earth, trying to orient himself by the direction of the wind. He rose again, his movements jagged and uncertain. He swung a sturdy branch before him like a pendulum, searching for a path that no longer existed. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a threat. He called her name, but his voice was swallowed by the silent expanse. He kept moving, one blind step after another, his throat parched and his voice cracking as he whispered her name. The wasteland was a landscape of dust and biting wind. Stefan moved with his staff held low, his ears straining against the howling gusts. He was miles from the tower, his boots worn thin by the jagged stone of the barren plains. He paused, leaning heavily on his staff, his chest heaving. Then the wind shifted. A sound cut through the dry air. It was a hum, soft and melodic, rising above the grit of the desert. Stefan straightened, his head snapping toward the direction of the vibration. He took a step, then another, his pace quickening despite the uneven ground. He tripped over a rock, his staff clattering away, but he did not stop. He crawled forward, his hands scraping against the sun-baked earth. The humming grew louder, more distinct, until it was right before him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against fabric. A gasp broke the silence. Two hands caught his shoulders, steadying him. He felt the warmth of another person, a stark contrast to the cold, dead air of the wasteland. He tilted his head, his sightless eyes fixed on the sound. Then, he felt the moisture. A drop landed on his cheek, followed by another. The liquid seeped into the jagged scars, cool and heavy. Stefan flinched as a sharp, electric tingle raced across his eyelids. He blinked, the movement stiff and painful. For a heartbeat, the darkness remained absolute. Then, a pinprick of light pierced the void. It widened, fracturing the blackness into jagged shards of gray and gold. He gasped, his hands gripping the shoulders of the person before him. The blur shifted, coalescing into the familiar lines of a face. The harsh, sun-scorched horizon sharpened into focus. The dust motes dancing in the air, the texture of the earth becoming visible. He saw the tears still clinging to her lashes. He saw the light reflecting in her eyes. The world was no longer a featureless void. He pulled her closer, his arms locking around her, the tension of the long months finally snapping. He breathed in, the air tasting of life. They stood in the center of the wasteland, the silence replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing. The nightmare had ended. The journey back was a blur of changing horizons. As the kingdom walls rose from the plains, the gates groaned open. Guards stood frozen, spears lowered. As the pair approached, Stefan walked with his head held high, his hand firmly gripping hers. They moved through the main square, the cobblestones echoing under their boots. People stopped. Conversations died. A hush rippled through the crowd as they recognized the features of the long-lost daughter. At the palace entrance, the husband and wife stood waiting. The wife stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached out. Rapunzel stopped, her fingers moving to the golden locket resting against her chest. She unclasped it, holding the metal out. The wife gasped, her thumb tracing the familiar engraving on the surface. She collapsed forward, pulling Rapunzel into a desperate embrace. The husband joined them, his arms wrapping around both. A roar of sound erupted from the surrounding crowd, cheers, shouts, and the frantic tolling of bells. The heavy tension shattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the celebration did not falter. It merely changed its hue. Torches flickered to life along the battlements, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone. Then, the first lantern rose. It drifted upward, a small, glowing orb of paper and flame, cutting through the twilight. One by one, hundreds followed. They ascended in a silent, steady stream, filling the vast expanse of the night sky until the darkness was indistinguishable from a sea of fallen stars. Faces aglow, they pointed, laughed, embraced. The weight of the past decades, finally lifting. The air grew warm with the glow of 1,000 floating fires. Below, the streets hummed with music and the rhythmic stomp of dancing feet. The kingdom was no longer a place of fear or guarded silence. It was a beacon, visible for miles across the plains. Every lantern represented a memory reclaimed, a hope restored. Miles away from the warmth of the lanterns, the tower stood as a jagged tooth against the night sky. Inside, the air grew thin and stagnant. The bioluminescent moss that once clung to the walls withered, turning to gray dust that drifted to the floor. Gothel sat in the center of the room, her hands resting on the cold, unyielding stone. She reached out, attempting to summon the familiar spark, but the air remained motionless. No hum of power answered, no shadow stirred. The magic that had sustained her for decades had drained away, leaving behind only the hollow weight of the structure. Outside, the wind howled, but it did not penetrate the thick, seamless walls. She was encased in a tomb of her own making. The silence was absolute. She stared at the window. The kingdom was celebrating, but here there was only the slow, rhythmic cooling of the stone. Midnight's chime fractured. Silence choked the nursery. Candles died. Shadows stirred. Dark fairy stalked the cradle, tracing air. Her voice, a rasping whisper, chilled the stone. Before the sun sets on her 16th birthday, she shall prick her finger on a spindle and fall into eternal sleep. The words hit the air like falling glass. The air in the room turned frigid. The infant stopped moving. The dark fairy withdrew, her presence fading back into the gloom, leaving behind a stillness that felt like a tomb. The kingdom outside remained unaware, but the foundation of the future had already cracked. The countdown had begun, and no amount of prayer could stop the gears of fate from turning toward the inevitable end. 16 years of silence passed, and the forest grew thick with secrets. Aurora walked the mossy paths, her feet finding purchase on roots worn smooth by time. She hummed a melody that felt older than the trees themselves, a song pulled from the wind. She stopped to touch a patch of sunlight filtering through the canopy, unaware of the history buried in her blood. A twig snapped. She spun around, hand hovering near a low-hanging branch. A man stepped from the brush, his boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. It was Prince Philip. He did not speak, but he offered a hand, his palm open and steady. Aurora hesitated, then reached out. Their fingers brushed, and the tension of the forest seemed to dissolve. They began to move, a slow, rhythmic sway across the ancient, uneven ground. Their laughter rose, sharp and bright, echoing against the thick trunks of the oaks. It was a dance of instinct, a magnetic pull that defied the quiet years of her upbringing. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the space between them. Every step was a heartbeat, every turn a discovery. They moved in perfect sync, the forest floor beneath them feeling like a stage built for this single fleeting connection. The air was warm. The sky began to bleed into a deep, bruised orange. The light shifted, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the moss. Aurora felt the change in the air before she saw it. The warmth of the dance evaporated, replaced by a sudden sharp chill that crawled up her spine. She stopped mid-step, her hand still resting in Philip's. The laughter died in her throat. A frantic, irrational pulse began to hammer against her ribs, a warning she could not translate into words. The forest, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. She looked at the horizon, where the sun was sinking behind the jagged tree line, and the sight triggered a violent, involuntary tremor in her limbs. She pulled her hand back as if burned. Philip reached out, his brow furrowed in confusion, but she retreated, her boots sliding on the damp earth. The magnetic pull that had drawn them together was now a repulsion, a terrifying instinct screaming at her to run. She did not explain. She did not look back. She turned, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and plunged into the dense, tangled thicket. The forest closed behind her, swallowing her whole. Aurora burst through the cottage door, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she slammed the latch shut behind her. She did not find the peace she expected. The three fairies were already moving, their hands snapping shut heavy wooden trunks. They stopped mid-motion, their faces tight with a terror she had never seen before. One reached out, grabbing her shoulders and forced her to look at them. "The woods are not a sanctuary anymore," they said. They laid the truth bare. She was not a child of the forest, but a princess born to a kingdom. The name she had lived by was a lie. Aurora pulled away, shaking her head, but they gripped her arms, their fingers digging into her skin with iron strength. They spoke of a curse, of a dark shadow that had tracked her for 16 years. The cottage, once a place of safety, now felt like a prison cell. They pulled her toward the door, their movements frantic and efficient. She was no longer a girl wandering the trees. She was a burden to be moved. The forest outside seemed to lean in, watching as they forced her into the dark, winding path that led away from everything she had ever called home. The castle walls loomed, cold and unyielding. They locked the door from the outside, the iron bolts sliding home with a final, heavy thud that echoed through the chamber. Aurora stood in the center of the room, her breath hitching in the stagnant air. The space was small, constructed of gray, damp stone that seemed to absorb the light. There was no window, no sound from the world beyond, only the weight of the silence pressing against her ears. She walked to the far wall, her palms flat against the rough surface, searching for a seam, a latch, anything to break the isolation. The stone was freezing. She pulled her hands back, rubbing them together, but the chill had already seeped into her skin. Then, the silence broke. A low, grinding sound vibrated through the floorboards, a guttural groan of rock shifting against rock. Aurora stepped back, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She watched as a hairline fracture appeared in the center of the wall, snaking upward like a jagged scar. The crack widened, the stone edges crumbling into dust, and a thin, piercing beam of neon green light bled into the room. It was not a natural glow. It pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly intensity. The neon green light flooded the room, washing out the color of the stone and turning the air into a thick, glowing mist. Aurora tried to turn away, but her muscles refused the command. Her head tilted to the side, her gaze locking onto the center of the pulsating fracture. The rhythmic hum of the light grew loud. She was no longer breathing in rhythm with the room. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, mechanical cadence. A sharp, invisible tension snapped taut behind her ribs. She took a step, then another, her feet dragging against the stone floor without sound. Her hands hung limp at her sides, fingers twitching in time with the flickering green glow. She reached the wall, her palm pressing against the cold, vibrating surface. The stone did not stop her. It yielded. A section of the masonry slid inward, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase that plummeted into the heart of the castle. She did not hesitate. She stepped into the narrow, suffocating darkness, her body moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. Each step she took was precise, as the staircase swallowed her whole. The spiral staircase ended in a small, circular chamber at the highest point of the turret. Dust motes hung suspended in the stagnant air, illuminated by the faint, sickly glow emanating from the center of the room. There, a wooden spinning wheel sat motionless, its spindle tipped with a needle that pulsed with a rhythmic, malevolent hum. Aurora moved toward it, her movements stiff and rhythmic, her gaze fixed entirely on the metallic point. Down below, the heavy castle gates groaned as they were forced open. The three fairies rushed into the courtyard, their wings beating against the stone walls with a frantic, desperate sound. They sprinted toward the base of the stairs, their feet pounding against the cold floor. They shouted her name, their voices echoing up the hollow shaft. But the air in the castle had grown thick and resistant, as if the very atmosphere were trying to hold them back. They pushed through the resistance, their breath coming in ragged gasps, climbing the stairs two at a time. They were too far behind. Aurora reached the spinning wheel. She stopped. Her hand rose, trembling slightly, fingers hovering inches from the sharp metallic tip. The fairies reached the landing, their hands outstretched, fingers clawing at the empty air. It was too late. Aurora pressed her fingertip down. The needle pierced the skin. A single dark drop of crimson blood welled up, bright and stark against her pale skin. The silence of the room shattered as the curse took hold. Aurora crumpled. Her knees hit the floor first, followed by her shoulders, her body folding into the velvet shadows like a marionette with its strings severed. As she struck the ground, a ripple of distorted air erupted from the spinning wheel. It was a visible pulse, a wave of gray energy that tore through the stone walls. The shockwave surged downward, moving with the speed of a falling star. In the throne room, the king stood to address his council. The words died in his throat. His hand, mid-gesture, locked into place. His eyes, fixed on the horizon, stopped blinking. In the courtyard, the guards froze mid-stride, their spears angled toward the sky, their boots hovering inches above the cobbles. The ripple hit the kitchen, where a cook dropped a ladle. The metal utensil hung suspended in the air, refusing to strike the floor. The shockwave moved through the castle like a cold front, snuffing out the motion of every living thing. Servants stopped mid-breath. Dogs ceased their barking. The kingdom was no longer a place of action, but a monument of stone and breath. Time had simply ceased to flow. The silence deepened, settling over the stone like a shroud. Outside the castle walls, the forest did not wait. Where the shockwave had passed, the earth cracked open. Thick, gnarled vines surged upward, twisting around the ramparts. Thorn walls sealed lightless, a stone tomb. Seasons cycled in the blink of an eye. Rain washed over the battlements, yet the water did not run. It clung to the mossy surfaces, frozen in place. Snow fell, coating the turrets in a layer of white that never melted. Inside, the dust settled on the motionless forms of the guards and the silent, unmoving staff. The air remained stale, trapped in the lungs of a kingdom that had forgotten how to breathe. The spinning wheel in the high tower stood as the silent heart of this stillness, its needle still humming with a faint, dying resonance. No bird sang in the eaves. No wind stirred the heavy, dark curtains. The kingdom was a monument to a single broken promise, a place where time had been discarded. Aurora lay in the shadows, a statue waiting for a hand that had not yet arrived. Thorns wove a cage, ending life's story. Dreams end, gates barred, lost path. The royal garden was silent, save for the rhythmic scrape of stone against stone. Luna stood by the central fountain, her fingers tracing the delicate, metallic veins of a silver rose. It was a perfect afternoon. Then, the wind shifted. A low, rhythmic thrum vibrated through the ground, rattling the fountain basin. From beyond the high stone walls, a thick, violet mist spilled over the top like ink into water. It did not drift. It surged. Luna stepped back, her boots crunching on the gravel as the vapor touched the nearest flower bed. The silver petals turned ash gray in a heartbeat. The vibrant luster drained away, leaving behind brittle, wilted husks that crumbled into dust at the slightest touch. She reached out to push the mist away, but the cold air bit into her skin, forcing her to recoil. The decay moved with terrifying speed, replaced by a sharp, metallic tang that burned in her throat. Luna turned toward the training grounds, her pulse quickening. Luna sprinted across the stone courtyard, her breath hitching in the stagnant air. She reached the center of the training grounds, expecting to see her 4 brothers practicing their drills. The space was empty. No shouts of exertion, no clatter of practice weapons. Only a profound, unnatural stillness remained. She scanned the perimeter, her eyes darting between the stone pillars. Then, she saw them. Near the weapons rack, 4 figures stood in a tight formation. They were not her brothers. They were stags, carved from translucent, shimmering glass. Luna approached, her footsteps echoing against the hard floor. She stopped inches from the nearest stag. It was perfectly still, yet a faint, rhythmic pulse rippled through its glass chest, like a heartbeat trapped in crystal. The stag slowly tilted its head. Its glass eyes caught her reflection, showing a face pale with realization. She looked toward the distant mountain gate. Luna grabbed a heavy cloak from the rack, wrapping it tight to brace against the mountain air. She turned to the 4 glass stags and gestured toward the gate. They moved with a soft, melodic chime. As she stepped beyond the kingdom walls, the path to Star Peak rose sharply before her. The trail was paved with jagged blue stones. The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became. A sudden, violent gust of wind howled down the slope. She pressed her side against the rock face, gasping as the wind tore at her balance. She was losing her grip. Then, the stags closed the gap. They circled her, forming a tight, protective perimeter. Their neon pink veins flared with intense, rhythmic light, creating a shimmering wall of heat that pushed back the freezing gale. With the path illuminated by their inner glow, Luna pushed forward, her footing finding purchase on the glowing stones. The final incline leveled off into a plateau of absolute stillness. Above, the moon hung at its zenith, casting a silver sheen over the jagged rocks. Luna stepped forward, her boots crunching on the frost, and stopped. Before her, the mountain air tore open. A golden waterfall cascaded from the stars themselves, spilling down into a basin of liquid light that churned with silent, rhythmic intensity. The radiance was blinding, forcing Luna to shield her eyes as the glow washed over the summit. She took a tentative step toward the pool, the heat radiating from the liquid warming her skin. Suddenly, the light in the basin began to coalesce. It spiraled upward, thickening into a massive, towering figure that lacked a solid frame. its form shifted like stardust caught in a gale, constantly reforming and dissolving. The entity stood between her and the basin, its presence pressing against her senses like a physical weight. The guardian raised a hand, its fingers elongated and shimmering, and pointed directly at the pool of light. Then, it shifted its aim to point at Luna's throat. The guardian rumbled, a sound like grinding stone. To save them, you must surrender your voice, so the forest may regain its song. The words hung in the thin air, vibrating against her skin. Luna looked at the basin. The golden liquid swirled, reflecting the stars above, indifferent to her humanity. She thought of the empty courtyard and the cold, glass statues waiting in the dark. She did not hesitate. She moved forward, her boots sinking into the soft, glowing silt at the pool's edge. She knelt, the stone biting into her knees, and reached out. Her palms hovered over the surface. The liquid felt heavy, like molten honey. She plunged her hands into the basin. A sharp, icy pull surged from her chest, traveling up her throat and down into her fingertips. It felt as if a physical thread was being unspooled from her lungs. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. The air in her throat turned to static. Her voice vanished, stripped away by the light, leaving a hollow ache where words once lived. In its place, a hum of pure, vibrating energy flooded her veins. She pulled her hands back, dripping with liquid starlight. Her throat was silent, but her fingertips burned with the power of 1,000 suns. She stood, her chest heaving, and turned toward the waiting stags. Luna walked toward the 4 glass stags. They stood motionless, their translucent bodies cold and unyielding against the mountain wind. She raised her hands, the golden light pulsing rhythmically against the dark summit. As she reached the first stag, she pressed her palms firmly against its chest. The glass did not yield at first. It hummed, vibrating with a high-pitched, discordant frequency that fought against her touch. Luna pushed harder, channeling the energy from her chest through her shoulders and into the frozen form. A hairline fracture appeared near the stag's neck. With a sound like 1,000 bells shattering at once, the glass exploded. Golden sparks showered the clearing, swirling into the air like fireflies. Where the stag had stood, a man appeared, gasping for air. Luna moved instantly to the next, then the third, and the fourth. Each touch was a violent release of light. The glass shards dissolved into mist before they hit the ground. One by one, the brothers collapsed onto the stone, their chests heaving. Luna stood back, her hands still flickering with the remnants of the starlight, watching as they stood up and looked at her in silence. The descent from the mountain was a blur of exhaustion and relief. Back within the city walls, the brothers looked to the throne, but the old order had dissolved with the curse. Luna led them not to the palace, but to a vacant, stone-walled structure near the city center. She cleared the dust from the heavy oak tables, her movements precise and rhythmic. This would be their sanctuary. She gathered rolls of thin, translucent silk and sheets of pressed paper, stacking them high. Her brothers watched, their hands still trembling from the cold of the glass. As she began to work, she did not use words to command them. She simply placed tools in their hands and guided their movements with a firm, silent touch. Luna moved through the workshop like a weaver of light. She folded the paper into intricate geometric shapes and stretched the silk over wire frames. When she brushed her fingertips against the finished lanterns, they did not just glow, they hummed. A soft, melodic vibration resonated from the silk. She hung the first one from the rafters, and the entire room shifted, the shadows retreating into the corners. The brothers began to follow her lead. Night settled over the city, cooling the stone streets and silencing the day's labor. Luna sat on the balcony, her gaze fixed on the vast, ink-black expanse above. Beside her, hundreds of lanterns waited, their silk surfaces pulsing with a rhythmic golden warmth. She reached out, her fingers trailing over the nearest frame, and pushed it gently into the air. It rose, caught by a steady breeze, and drifted toward the clouds. One by one, she released the rest. They ascended in a slow, synchronized stream, turning the dark sky into a tapestry of floating embers. Below, the citizens emerged from their homes, heads tilted upward, watching the lights drift like stars returning to their home. The lanterns hummed, a collective melody that vibrated against the cool night air, wrapping the city in a blanket of sound and radiance. Luna watched the glowing butterflies that had gathered around her hands, their wings flickering in time with the lanterns above. She did not need to speak. The light she cast was a language of its own, a testament to the bond she had restored. The sky burned with a soft, steady brilliance, marking the end of the long shadow. The last of the lanterns drifted beyond the horizon, blending into the brightening sky. Luna remained on the balcony, her hands resting on the cold stone railing. The air shifted, losing the sharp bite of the night, and gaining the soft, damp warmth of the coming morning. Across the city, the first shutters opened. People stepped onto their porches, looking up at the fading trails of light that still lingered in the upper atmosphere. Luna watched them. She felt the weight of the past months dissolve, not through speech or declaration, but through the simple, observable reality of a city that was breathing again. She raised her hand. A cluster of glowing butterflies, born from the residual energy of her craft, swirled around her fingers. They moved in perfect, silent harmony, mirroring the rhythm of her own pulse. She realized then that the silence was not a void, it was a bridge. Every gesture she made, every flicker of light she produced, carried more weight than any spoken command ever could. The sun broke the horizon, spilling liquid gold across the rooftops and turning the dew on the balcony into scattered diamonds. She leaned back, closing her eyes to feel the sun on her face. The struggle was gone. The kingdom was whole. She did not need to speak to know that her work was finished, and that in the quiet, she had finally found the peace she had fought to secure. The world glowed, steady and bright, under the first light of a new day.